What is actually happening in the last mard right now sits in direct contradiction to everything Washington wants you to believe. The framing coming out of the White House is almost entirely disconnected from what observers can see with their own eyes. Iran's Deputy Foreign Minister Qasem Gharibi walked into these talks and made Tran's position clear from the start. This delegation did not come to negotiate. It came to issue demands. That distinction carries real weight. When a party arrives at a table and announces it will not exchange concessions, but will instead present terms, that party does not believe it lost. And the demands leave no room for ambiguity, authority over the Strait of Hormuz, full war reparations, the unfreezing of all blocked Iranian financial assets, a comprehensive permanent regional ceasefire, and long-term security guarantees covering not just Iran, but every proxy network it maintains across the Middle East. Iran's official social media accounts posted it in capital letters. This discussion is centered on our demands. They also posted time to seal the victory in beautiful Islamabad. And none of that reads like the language of a nation that has been broken. If you're learning something here, please hit subscribe. Many of you are aware of what's been happening with the channel. If you feel like supporting, a link in the description. I spent months researching what's coming between 2026 and 2030, and I put it all into an ebook called The Next Global Shift: How to Stay Ahead of Economic Collapse and War. The economies, the conflicts, the moves you need to make. If you want my ebook, link in the description. Let's get into the video. Now, compare that to what the Trump administration has been broadcasting publicly, because the contrast tells you almost everything. Trump posted this morning that Iran is losing and losing big, and then wrote, and this needs to be stated clearly, praise be to Allah, mockingly invoking the deaths of Iranian leaders while his own negotiating team sat across a table from Iran's foreign minister and parliament speaker at that very moment. That is not psychological pressure applied with strategic intent. That is incoherence. You do not mock your counterpart's religion and they're dead, while your own people are in the room trying to reach an agreement with those same counterparts. The Strait of Hormuz incident from today reveals the problem even more sharply. A senior American official told Axios reporter Barak Rabid that several U.S. Navy destroyers transited the strait from east to west and back again, completely unimpeded with no Iranian contact whatsoever. Iran's Tasnim agency and the foreign ministry spokesperson told a completely different story. A U.S. destroyer approached the strait, received a direct warning from Iran's armed forces, and turned back. According to the Iranian account, Iran's foreign minister and parliament speaker informed Pakistani Prime Minister Sharif mid-negotiation that the vessel was approaching, stated Iran would walk out if it did not retreat, and the destroyer turned around. The two competing accounts presented in these negotiations cannot easily be reconciled, and the behavioral patterns surrounding the talks point in sharply different interpretive directions depending on which set of signals one prioritizes. From Iran's perspective, the optics of the moment are intentionally assertive. Iranian officials arrive projecting confidence rather than hesitation, accompanied by a narrative of strategic success that was visibly reinforced through state messaging and diplomatic choreography. The imagery of senior Iranian representatives traveling with visible security and prestige, combined with carefully crafted public statements emphasizing strength and inevitability, was designed to signal that Tehran does not view itself as a defeated or cornered actor. Instead, it is attempting to frame the post-conflict environment as a continuation of bargaining from a position of leverage rather than recovery. This posture is consistent with the broader Iranian approach of turning negotiation settings into platforms for consolidating gains already achieved on the ground. On the other side, the United States approach appears less unified in presentation and more fragmented in execution. The composition of the American delegation, as described in the discourse, has become a focal point of interpretation. Critics argue that the inclusion of political operatives and advisors without deep technical specialization in nuclear engineering or enrichment architecture introduces a structural imbalance in technical negotiations. In this framing, Iran arrives with a dense institutional cadre of nuclear scientists, diplomats, and security experts who possess long-term continuity and technical fluency, while the American side is portrayed as more politically driven and less technically embedded. Whether or not this assessment fully reflects internal U.S. decision-making, it highlights a perceived asymmetry in expertise that becomes especially consequential once negotiations shift from broad political principles to implementation mechanics. These talks, according to both narratives, have entered a phase where technical verification and enforcement mechanisms matter more than declaratory positions. At this stage, the negotiation is no longer about symbolic concessions, but about the precise architecture of compliance, sequencing, monitoring, and guarantees. In such environments, the side with deeper institutional memory and technical continuity is often perceived as having an advantage. Iran's negotiating posture, therefore, is interpreted by its supporters as one grounded in procedural mastery, while the American side is framed as relying more heavily on political signaling and executive authority rather than granular technical control. At the same time, the broader regional context is being used to reinforce competing claims about credibility and enforcement. Reports of continued military activity in Lebanon, particularly involving strikes attributed to Israeli forces against Hezbollah-linked infrastructure, are interpreted differently depending on the narrative lens. In the Iranian framing, such developments are cited as evidence that ceasefire arrangements tied to broader regional de-escalation frameworks are being violated in real time, raising questions about whether guarantees associated with U.S.-backed diplomacy are enforceable through allied actors. From this perspective, ongoing hostilities during negotiation windows weaken the perceived reliability of external assurances and reinforce a preference for extracting concrete, immediate, and verifiable concessions rather than relying on phased or conditional agreements. This line of reasoning leads to a broader strategic conclusion within the Iranian narrative that agreements with external powers are only as strong as their enforcement mechanisms, and that historical precedent encourages skepticism toward commitments that depend on multiple layers of allied compliance. As a result, Iran's negotiating posture is interpreted as prioritizing upfront, measurable, and irreversible gains rather than gradual, trust-based implementation. The demand-driven framing of negotiations, in this view, is not merely rhetorical, but structurally rationalized as a response to perceived asymmetries in enforcement reliability. Meanwhile, the American political signaling around the same period is characterized by fluctuating messaging and rhetorical inconsistency, particularly in public statements that appear to shift tone depending on audience and context. In this interpretation, such variability is read not as deliberate strategic ambiguity, but as reactive communication under pressure, shaped by competing domestic and international audiences. The effect of this, in the eyes of critics, is a weakening of narrative cohesion at precisely the moment when coherence is most important for signaling resolve in high-stakes diplomacy. Ultimately, the situation is defined by divergence in perceived reality. One side enters the negotiation framework believing that its battlefield and diplomatic position has translated into leverage sufficient to dictate terms. The other side appears to be managing a more complex set of alliances, domestic expectations, and parallel conflicts that complicate unified signaling. The result is not simply a disagreement over terms, but a deeper contest over interpretation itself, over who has momentum, who controls escalation, and whose guarantees are actually credible in a system where enforcement is distributed across multiple actors and theaters. In that sense, the talks in Islamabad become less about a single agreement and more about the broader structure of post-conflict power. Each delegation arrives not only with proposals, but with a theory of how international commitments function in practice. And it is precisely the gap between those theories that defines the tension at the table.